Hi, I'm James Purser, and this is Purser Explores the World, recorded on the 7th of July 2012. Well, it's been a little while between drinks, but here we are again. Before we delve into episode 7, I thought I would catch us all up on how the Australian women's ice hockey team went back in March. As you may remember, they were due to wing off to Slovenia late in March to compete in the Division 2A group of the World Women's Ice Hockey Championships. Well, I can say that while they didn't win the division, I think it can be safely said that they held their own. Of the 5 matches they played, they won 3 and lost 2, including a most excellent thrashing of New Zealand at 7-2 goals. They will be back again next year. Now on to the 7th episode of Purser Explores the World. The ability to reliably generate electricity is probably one of the greatest enabling technologies ever invented by humankind. Without electricity, we wouldn't have simple things such as refrigerators, telephones, or the interwebs. For the most part, people have been content to get their electricity from the massive, centralised networks set up by governments and private businesses over the last 100 or so years. Let's be honest, there weren't exactly a lot of alternatives, and what there was so far out of your average homeowner's league that it wasn't feasible. However, over the past 2 decades, there has been a growing movement away from relying on the ageing distribution networks and gigantic power stations towards a more renewable, local solution. For many people, this has meant moving their hot water to solar heating. For others, it's meant going that extra mile and installing enough solar capacity to address the power needs of their entire house. For some groups, it's meant more than that. Leonards Hill is a small village about 10 kilometres south of the town of Daylesford in central Victoria. It's also the home for Australia's first wind cooperative, the Hepburn Wind Project. Initially floated as an idea way back in 2004, the Hepburn Wind Farm was officially launched in 2007 with a co-op share offer. It took until October 2010 until they could break ground, with power starting to flow from the turbines in June 2011. The official grand opening of the Hepburn Wind Farm was November 5th, 2011. Since then, the 2 towers have been generating enough power to run between 300 and 2,500 homes, depending on the wind strength at the time. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get Hepburn Wind for an interview. However, the people behind the wind farm have not rested on their laurels. They are, in fact, working to create other co-ops around the country. I was, however, able to get hold of Anya Schoolman from the Mount Pleasant Solar Co-op in Washington, D.C., and she also helps to run the National Community Power Network in the States.
So we started the project 5 years ago as just a local project, and that was the Mount Pleasant Solar Cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't even know sort of what model we were going to use, whether we were going to own all the panels and, like create a business, or whether we were just going to be sort of a community organization. And I can go back and explain the model later. But what happened was we ended up becoming a community organization, and we helped about 100 families go solar in a very small neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and we got a lot of attention both in D.C. and nationally because of the effort, got people really excited about what we did. And so 2 things happened. One, I started getting requests from all over D.C. for help, and so we've actually helped 10 other cooperatives form in Washington, D.C., and then we've all joined together to be a network called D.C. Solar United Neighborhoods, or D.C. Sun.
Mm-hmm.
And so we work as a group in Washington, D.C. now. And then at the same time, there was a Discovery feature on Discovery TV, did a documentary about us, and we got some national news coverage. So I started getting calls from all over the U.S. and actually some international calls. So I set up the group Community Power Network and created a website, which was really a way for similar groups to find each other. And so the website lets a group, wherever they are, really wherever they are. The focus is the U.S. and Canada, but it really could be anywhere in the world. any group can create a page that tells about their group, and then there's a shared documents and a shared calendar and things like that. So it's really to help groups network and work together. So I'm sort of working, very local neighborhood, citywide, regionally, because now I've gotten help from nearby states, and then nationally. And I'll kind of do it at the same time.
Before we go into the network, because I'm looking at the network side at the moment, and you've got groups here on your map from, both all the way across the continental U.S.
Uh-huh.
But what made you decide to set up your own co-op in the first place?
It was kind of an accident. So what happened was really my son, who was 12 at the time, he's now 17, and his friend had gone to see the movie Inconvenient Truth, and they'd come back, and they're like, we have to do something. And I worked in the environmental movement, but I didn't have any expertise at all in solar energy. And so we looked into going solar on our house, and we called, we actually got a list from our local government of local installers. There was about 20. We called them all, and only 2 showed up. And then the 2 that showed up, it was very expensive. They told us completely contradictory things, and it was really overwhelming and confusing. And this is 5 years ago. It's not that hard today as it was then, but and so we said to the kids at the time, if we're going to go to all the work to figure this out, we should do the whole neighborhood, because it's not worth the effort to do it for just one house. Are you in? And so we sort of thought that would be the end of it with the kids, and instead they made a flyer, and they called it the Mount Pleasant Solar Cooperative, and they started dropping the flyers at everybody's doorsteps and basically said, do you want to join this effort? 2 weeks later, we had 50 members, and we had no idea what we were going to do. So then we started having meetings with our neighbors and talking to them and figuring out, what were people's goals and what did they want and what was the price range. And, we really figured out that what we had to do needed to be, people were not willing or not able, for the most part, to pay extra for solar. So they had to either be paying the same amount as conventional electricity or less. And it had to be easy. And so we spent about a year exploring different models and approaches, and then we got involved with some legislation in the D.C. government, which created some very strong incentives. And then we really, our goal all along was not just to put solar on our own houses, but to create a system so that anybody, to make it scalable. So we looked at a lot of options like fundraisers or grants, but we rejected them because we thought, well, then we'll do our project, but it's not going to help anybody else. So that's why we shifted a lot of the focus to some advocacy and passing some legislation. And, 2 years later, essentially, we've done the first 45 houses.
So each individual house generates its own power and consumes its own power, doesn't it?
Exactly. So the way we originally, one of the things we thought about is some sort of collective ownership, and we might have had to do that under a previous set of rules. But once we set up an incentive program through our D.C. government that was focused on residential, it made sense for each homeowner to actually have their own panels on their own roof and own them themselves.
So you have a tariff feed-in or something?
What?
You have a tariff rate that you get, so you can...
We don't have a tariff rate. What we have, it's very convoluted, but we actually have the ability to... We've created there was a grant program that was set up. There's a surcharge on the utility bills that created a pool of money. And so out of that money, they took a small percentage and created a rebate for solar.
Oh, okay.
So that's the main incentive at that time. And then we've also created a market for selling the, it's called the solar renewable energy credit. So that's like the green attribute of the electricity. and so that's an additional incentive. And then there's also a federal tax incentive.
So you actually built your own
market. If you combine those
market.
all three, it becomes a great deal.
So you actually built your own market to trade on trade the power that you generate.
Pretty much. Yeah, the theory of the market was there. There had been an earlier piece of legislation that passed what they call a renewable portfolio standard, which is long-term targets with compliance fines for renewables in the grid. But what we discovered is that the compliance fines were too low. And so rather than, even though the rule looked really good on the books, everybody's like, yeah, 20% renewables by 2020, are we great? And then we looked at it, and it turned out the utility wasn't putting any renewables on the grid. They were just paying the fines. And so that was one of the things we did, is we went back to the legislature and said, you have to double the fines because we want the utility to play, not pay. That was our motto.
If it's
and
cheaper
that's
to actually pay the fine, they'll just do that.
Yeah.
All right, so you've got Mount Pleasant set up, and now you've got more communities within the DC area. What made you decide to go national? What made you decide to set up this network?
It was really two things. First, I was getting a lot of requests for information. And so I had collected, case studies and reports that other people had done, and had started to meet just through, people calling people for ideas and information, sort of peers across the country. And so the first reason was sort of a defensive act, which was I need some way that I could easily help people, because I was getting overwhelmed. Like I would get 5 calls or emails from, the state of Texas. And so then I'd send them all emails to each other and say, hey, you're all in Texas, you should work together. Because in the states, energy policy is for the most part made at the state level, not the federal level. Mm-hmm. So I was emailing people documents, and I was getting overwhelmed and confused. And so I really felt that I had to create a website just to centralize the information and also make it so, for example, one group in Texas could find another group in Texas without me having to be in the middle. So to sort of liberate that energy. And then the other reason why we created Community Power Network was talking to some of the activists across the country, and we really realized that there was, in fact, a movement. You can call it community power movement, or you could call it a movement for decentralized renewable energy, but that the participants in the movement weren't aware of each other. We didn't self-identify as a movement, and we weren't working together to strengthen each other politically. And so the hope is that at least a starting step on that is to get some of that on a map, so you can look at it and see, wait, it's not just me. There's a lot of people that are trying to do this. And that's the first step, and where we take it, we're still trying to figure out, I guess.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at your map, and as I said before, you've got groups going from the eastern seaboard right across until Washington State. Now, you have 50 states in the U.S., and as you said, a lot of the energy policy is done at the state level. Does this cause a lot of confusion when you're trying to help each other out?
Yes, it does. And in some ways, even there's different vocabulary for similar things. Mm-hmm. There is one wonderful website called Desire USA, which is the database of state incentives for renewable energy. Mm-hmm. It's actually paid for by the government, which at least is a good starting point where if somebody calls me from, Milwaukee, or somebody calls me from Montana and I have no idea what the incentives, I always tell them, go to that website first, understand the incentives in your locality, and then call me back and we'll brainstorm. So at least we have a good resource for some of that base information.
You've got an election coming up in the States at the moment, and energy policy is going to be a huge issue. What would you like to see happen there?
Well, it's not for me to say, I guess, what should happen in the rest of the world, because I feel like one, the U.S. just has so much responsibility to get their own house in order that I feel like that's what we need to focus on. But I have to say that in Canada, in many ways, they're way ahead of us. And there are some amazing groups in Canada that we really look to as models for where we'd like to go, and obviously in Europe as well. And again, is what the energy policy is so different in each country that it's also hard for me to say exactly whether.
All right, well, just focus on the States then.
Yeah, but one of the things that
sorry, go on.
I guess the thing that I think is common internationally as well as nationally is I think that there's some basic principles. First of all, decentralized energy makes sense, but the predominant business model is centralized. You know, it's big power plants, big bank invested, bank owned, whether it's renewables or non-renewables. And what we're seeing is that the decentralized power is, for renewables, you can deploy it faster, it's more efficient, it's more resilient, and it integrates at the grid better because it's dispersed. And it's also develops more quickly because people are willing to take a lower return on the investment because it's not a big bank, it's a homeowner or a school or a church, and they're not looking to make 16% return. They just want to, not lose money to do it. So what you see, for example, in Germany is that the total quantity of renewables on the grid, the vast majority is in fact decentralized distributed generation. And so one of the things people need to realize, and I think what we have in common, is that there's huge public support for this. And across party lines, people want renewables, they like developing and owning their own power, but the policies that we have right now are all directed, for the most part, towards this centralized, large utility-scale development. And so what we need is for the policies and the politicians to basically align with the people more clearly and liberate what's essentially this force of, people who want to do this. They're willing to spend their own money on it, but the way that the policies are structured, it makes it difficult.
That was Anya Skillman from the Community Power Network. Now, I will be including links to all of the sites that she's mentioned in the show notes, so have a look there. The idea of starting a co-op to meet a community need is not new. However, this is a very excellent way of ensuring that the largest amount of people are able to access the convenience and the self-reliance that being able to generate their own power brings. And as you heard during the interview, you can branch that out. I mean, they've created their own electricity market just within their members. Operations like Hepburn Wind and the Mount Plower Solar Co-op are leading the way, and frankly, they should be encouraged by governments who are concerned about the rising costs of maintaining an ageing electricity grid. If we set up a number of co-ops, say suburb or town-based, all of a sudden we're not having to pull so much power from the large power stations up in the Hunter or across the country. We're able to do it locally and maintain it locally. Well, that's it for another episode of Purser Explores the World. Thanks for your patience. I will be producing more episodes on a more regular basis, so stick with me. Also remember, if you want to discuss this episode or if you want to keep up to date with other Angry Beanie productions, you can follow Angry Beanie on Twitter, circle it on Google+, or like it on Facebook.